My name is Larry Siegel, and I am here to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lorenzo Boyd. And I would like to say that I first met Lorenzo about 20 years ago. And here's the story how I met him. My son, Eric, was a student at William and Mary, and Dr. Boyd was a professor there. And Eric's girlfriend, Veronica, decided to take his class, which was criminology. And in it, he happened to use a book I wrote, which was called Criminology. And on the first day of class, he said to the class, Siegel doesn't know anything about criminology. He just knows what he read in books and articles, but I live it. I've been there. I'm from the inner city. I know all about it. So that night, Veronica called me and said, Larry, my professor said you don't know anything about criminology, not a thing. And I said, oh, really? I think I know a little, but okay. A while later, we had the National Conference of Criminology, and I see a guy walking around with a name tag that says Lorenzo Boyd. And I went up to him and I said, I heard you told your class I don't know anything about criminology. And he got really defensive. He thought I was mad at him, but I thought it was kind of funny. So since then, a lot has changed. Lorenzo Boyd is not at William and Mary anymore. He's held teaching positions at a number of top schools. He was chairman of the criminology department at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And then he went to the University of New Haven, where he was the head of the very famous criminal justice criminology department there. And that's nationally known also for its forensic program, which he could probably fill you in on better than me, the Henry Lee program. And due to his great work and fine personality, he was just promoted to be vice president of the university. In addition to that, he's held major positions in our field, not to the least of which was president of the National Association. And he's written articles, books, and other scholarly works, and he is one of the leading experts on police and the community. So I will turn this discussion over to him, and I will be quiet for a change. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you. And it's funny that that story is going to never change, that class at William and Mary. Thanks. Welcome, folks. And again, my apologies. My day job kind of got in the way of this. We had to do things a little differently. So thank you for allowing me to switch times on you. Again, my name is Lorenzo Boyd. By way of background, I spent 14 years as a sheriff's deputy in Boston, and about 7 of those years, I was detailed out to the city police in Boston. And the last 20 years of my career, I've been a university professor. I've been researching and writing about and training police for the last 20 years. So I do a lot of police training across the country with different agencies. And most years I do between 250 and 300 hours a year of training police officers. So to put that in context, that's roughly equivalent to me running a 6 or 7 week police academy. 8 hours a day for 5 days. That's about as much training as I do. But I also do a lot of after incident reports. So I get called in when there are issues in policing, and I put a team together, and typically within about 72 hours, I'll have a team together on the ground. So we were in Ferguson, Missouri on day 3 of those riots. We were in Baltimore on day 4 of those riots. We were in Baton Rouge. We were in Tulsa, Oklahoma with the Terrence Crutcher issue. So a lot of times I get called in, and it's my job to help facilitate what's going on. So if you were to ask my elevator speech, what do I do? The short answer is I build bridges between the police and the community, particularly communities of color. So in today's talk, I'm assuming you can see my my PowerPoint here. So in today's talk, we're going to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. We're going to talk about George Floyd, and we're going to talk about protests. How did we get here, and where do we go now? Because we have a habit of looking at things in a vacuum And it's funny that the older we get, the less we call on history to frame what we're trying to do. So in order for us to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and why it's a movement and what it's meant to do, we have to talk about how we got here. And a lot of that has to do with the protests. So as we start talking, let's first start off with talking about modern policing, because whenever I'm listening to a speaker, I always want to know what their bias is. So I try to give people my bias up front. So my background is in policing. I spent a decade and a half doing the job and the subsequent 20 years researching it. So the lens that I view things is through a policing lens. So I'm putting my bias right out front. So when we talk about modern policing, particularly in a free and democratic society, policing involves the delicate balance of three things. The first one is invoking police power. And the police do two things really well. They use force and they detain. If neither of those are the objectives that you want, then calling the police is probably not the call that you want. But the delicate balance is between invoking police power, which the police do really well. Number two is the use of coercion, because the police will typically convince you to do something that you didn't want to do or convince you not to do something that you were planning to do. And number three, we have to balance constitutional rights. The constitutional rights of everyone, even the people that we suspect have committed a crime, even the people that we believe have committed a crime, still maintain constitutional rights. Because again, they haven't been adjudicated when they're dealing with the police. So right now, they're just suspects. But as we move forward with policing, in order for maintenance to be established in the community, we have to allow the police to do their jobs. But in order for the police to do their job, the public must trust and believe in the authority of the police. So when I talk to the police, I ask them about their authority. How do you derive your authority? And sometimes they'll say from the state. Well, no, that's not exactly correct. Or they'll say from my municipality, from my city, from my town, from the county. Well, no, that's not it. They will say, well, the power is derived from my badge or the uniform that I wear or my gun. Well, no, that's actually not correct either. The power and authority of the police is derived from citizens. Citizens give the police their level of power. And without citizen interaction and citizen buy-in, the police can't do their job. So it's important that we have a functioning working relationship between the police and the people that they're supposed to serve. So let's step back. And before I go further, let me explain that I'm a classically trained sociologist. So my default is to try to understand the relationship between people. So when we talk about people, how people interact, it's really easy for us to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt because we believe we're good people, that we're trying to do the right thing, but we also acknowledge that sometimes we have a bad day and we do bad stuff. So even when we do bad stuff, that doesn't mean we're not good people. There's a term that we use called cognitive dissonance. When what you believe and what you do are not in alignment, we then try to justify what we do as opposed to changing our behavior. And we justify if I do something bad because somebody else forced me to, or because I was having a bad day, or because of somebody else's action. And it's really easy for us to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. But what's really harder in society is giving others that same benefit of the doubt. And if you can acknowledge in your personal life, giving other people the benefit of the doubt sometimes is difficult. Imagine being a police officer. Imagine dealing with the people that you deal with every day. Giving them the benefit of the doubt is a lot harder. So when we see things, when we see that people do things, we often ask ourselves, how could somebody act this way? How is it that somebody could do this? And we take that approach that they are different from us. But there's a better question to ask. Instead of asking, why would someone do that? in order to build levels of empathy, we should ask ourselves, what would have to happen to me in order for that course of action to be something that I would do? Part of what I want to do here is to get you to empathize with the other side. Again, I'm not trying to change anybody's mind. I'm not trying to change any political affiliations, but I am trying to get you to put yourself in someone else's shoes to try to understand some of the things that are going on with other people. What would have to happen in my life in order for me to act whatever way, fill in the blank? So when I talk about police-community relations, the first issue is understanding the problem. Before we can talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, we have to understand what historically is going on, because nothing happens in a vacuum. So I've worked with hundreds of police departments across the country, and typically when I go in, they bring me in because there's a real disconnect between the police and communities of color. So they call me and I put a team together, we go in and we start looking at the department. And generally somebody will say to me that some outside agency has looked at their policies and procedures and they've deemed them to not be racially biased. And I applaud them for that. But you've got three options. Either your policies are problematic, your procedures are problematic, or your practice is problematic. It's one of those three. But if you tell me your policies and procedures are not racially biased, why then is there still such tension between the police and the community, particularly communities of color? And the easy thing is, oh, it's them, it's the other people, it's always them. But sometimes it's helpful to take an introspective look at what's going on with you. What are you doing to exacerbate the situation? What are you doing to make things better or to make things worse? Because people's perception form the basis of their reality. And I'm sure you've heard the term perception is reality. You could be the nicest person in the world, but if I think you're a knucklehead, I'm going to deal with you as such. If I think you're a jerk, I'm going to deal with you as such. So people's perceptions form the basis of their reality and thus their actions. So they act accordingly based on how they believe. And if they believe that the police historically has been problematic, then these community members aren't going to work with the police. They're not going to want to work with the police if there's been a history of problems between the two. So we move forward to protests. And people ask this question all the time. Since the murder of George Floyd this summer, I've done well over 100 interviews, CNN, MSNBC, and for whatever reason, Fox News regularly brings me on to talk about some of these things. And the questions that I get, why are people so upset? Then the next question is, what has protesting ever accomplished? And then people pull out their hair and say, why the destruction of property? I don't get it. Why are people tearing down things? Why are people destroying property? Why are they burning buildings in their community? This doesn't accomplish anything. And many people in the webinar may be asking those very same questions. And it's completely fine if that's your question. But let's take a historic look at how things have worked. When we ask, what has protesting ever accomplished? Let's start with the first protest in our country, the Boston Massacre in 1770. The colonial citizens protested against the government vis-a-vis the British Army. That protest, that was the first protest in our country that turned deadly. And for those that are history buffs, remember there were 4 people killed at the Boston Massacre. The first person killed, Crispus Attucks, was the first time that we have in our history an unarmed person of color being killed by an arm of the government, the military. So the unarmed black person being killed by the police is not a new phenomenon. It's something that's been going on in our country, but I digress. But understand that this first protest turned very violent and turned deadly. So let's move forward a little bit. 1773, the Boston Tea Party. And a lot of people have been taught a convenient history of the Boston Tea Party, and we say that the colonists from Boston and Massachusetts were heroes in what they did. Well, let's understand. Let's talk about the inconvenient history. So the colonists, the vast majority of them were white and male. They darkened their skin. They put on the garb of Native Americans. Under the cloak of darkness, they pretended to be Native Americans. They climbed on the ship. They destroyed, in today's terms, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of product vis-a-vis the tea. And then they wrecked the ship so badly that the ship stayed in dry dock almost a year before it was able to be repaired and to be sailed back to Great Britain. Remember, these people darkened their skin and pretended to be Native Americans. So when the British Army came in and heard the tales of what happened, they slaughtered thousands of Native Americans who did absolutely nothing wrong. But yet these protesters, these people that destroyed property, history paints them as heroes. What about the New York City draft riots, 1863? Remember, in the US, there were a lot of wars that we were getting into. Not enough people were volunteering for the military, so the government decided that they were going to start a draft. People in New York decided they didn't want to be part of the draft, so not only did they protest, not only did they riot, but they burned down government buildings in the state of New York. Who were these people? Remember, the year was 1863, 2 years before the abolition of slavery. These were not people of color. They burned down buildings in New York to protest the draft. The women's suffrage movement. We talk about women wanted the right to vote, so they marched and they protested. That's the convenient history. The inconvenient history is realizing that in the suffrage movement, a lot of these women put bombs in mailboxes and on porches, and they blew up a lot of stuff. They went to businesses in the downtown area under the cloak of darkness at night, and they broke out a lot of windows. And then eventually they got the right to vote. And when we talk about the suffrage movement, we say this is when women got the right to vote. That's only part of the story. That's partially correct. Because here, white women got the right to vote because blacks in this country didn't get the right to vote en masse until 1965. Boston police strike, 1919, my beloved city of Boston. When the police decided that they weren't getting paid enough and they didn't have enough benefits, and they realized that the secretaries that worked for the city got paid more than them and had better benefits, the police in Boston decided to do a work stoppage, and no one cared. They decided to protest, and no one cared. The police officers in Boston started a riot, and for those of you that know the history or from the area, Boston police officers burned City Hall to the ground. The Boston police burned Boston City Hall to the ground. And because of that, the governor at the time decided that he was going to renegotiate with the Boston police to give them a better quality of life. Prohibition, 1933, the riots, the bloodshed for the right to drink. They were rioting for the right to get drunk. And because of all the rioting, ultimately we repealed prohibition. You get the point. So when we ask, what does protesting ever accomplish? Why the property damage? Why riots? I offer to you, protesting and rioting and destruction of property is as American as apple pie. It's what we do in this nation. It's how this nation was formed. So now all of a sudden in 2020, we've decided that we're beyond that and we don't understand why people are rioting. Do we understand over the course of our nation, every major accomplishment that happened in this nation came after a protest and a riot. So then the question, what are protests for? Are they really an indication that something's wrong? Or at the very least, something needs to change? So then the question to ask yourself, who is it that's resistant to this change? Who are the people that are resistant to this change? So could we actually say that as a nation, we are constantly evolving and growing because of protests? And protests are actually necessary for the health and progress of our nation. And for those that don't see that, they're ignoring history. They're ignoring the level of history that a lot of people don't want. People want to listen to a convenient history, that things were nice and tidy as our country was growing, but that's not true. That's an inconvenient truth. So in a sense, participating in the process of protesting, couldn't we say that's actually a part of modern policing? Protesting. It's how America did what it did. And again, it's not my job to justify protests. As a classically trained sociologist, it's my job to explain why these things happened or why they were likely to happen. So let's move forward. The lead law enforcement person in our country, James Comey, when he was the director of the FBI, he gave a speech in 2015. And he says, we've got to acknowledge some things in our country. We have some hard truths in our country that we need to acknowledge. And the funny thing about America is they don't want to acknowledge the ugly history of our past because it's really inconvenient. It's not easy for us to talk about it. And my question is, imagine how uncomfortable you feel talking about it. Now imagine what the people are going through to have to live it every single day. So let's talk about these three hard truths. One, much of the law enforcement history is not a pretty history. Much of the history of policing in this country just simply is not a pretty history. And we need to acknowledge that in order to move forward. Number two, there's a widespread existence of unconscious bias. And I will add to that, there's also a significant amount of conscious bias in policing. And number three, that I can attest to, something happens to people over time in policing. In all forms of law enforcement, something happens. People become cynical over time. People start to not trust over time. It's unfortunate, but it's actually what happens in policing by and large. But we tend to have a really convenient view of history. So when we talk about convenient history of policing, everybody talks about Sir Robert Peel, who was the equivalent of the Secretary of State in Great Britain in their parliament. And he introduced legislation in 1828, and it became law in 1829 to establish the London Metropolitan Police. That was the first large-scale, uniformed, organized municipal police department that we had. And because of that, we refer to Sir Robert Peel as the father of modern policing. That's a real convenient history. It's a really tidy place to say that's where policing started. But the inconvenient history is policing in this country actually started 100 years before with slave patrols. 1704 in South Carolina, a lot of people in the South, predominantly white men with long guns, were riding around at night looking for people of color that were not on plantations. Because remember, escaping slavery was against the law. Let that marinate a little bit. Escaping slavery, seeking freedom, was against the law. And we had a police force, slave patrollers, that their whole job was to go around and snatch up people of color who were not in the right place or they were looking for freedom. That's the inconvenient history of policing. So then people ask, why the anger? Why now? Why right now are people so upset? Who is George Floyd and why is people so upset about him? And the answer that I give to that is this is not just a snapshot in time. When you ask about the protests, when you ask about the anger, It's not just about George Floyd. It's not just about Breonna Taylor. It's not just about Ahmaud Arbery or Michael Brown or Sandra Bland or Walter Scott or Terrence Crutcher or Tamir Rice or Laquan McDonald or Freddie Gray or Alton Sterling or Eric Garner or Philando Castile or Botham Jean or Rashard Brooks. And that's just in the last few years. The vast majority of these people were completely unarmed, with the exception of Philando Castile, who actually legally had a firearm that was holstered when he was shot and killed. So to understand the disconnect between the police and people of color, I'm asking you to be empathetic and understand the perspective of the people that are out there protesting. We need a historical context, because nobody wakes up in the morning and decides, you know what, I'm going to protest against the government. Most people don't do that. So imagine how bad things have to be for people to, one, protest against the government because of police brutality. Two, protest the very people that you think are most likely to hurt you. And three, to do it during a global pandemic. How bad do you think things have to be for people? Because people are fed up. People are sick and tired of seeing unarmed people of color being killed over and over and over again, and the perpetrators for their death virtually almost never, hardly ever, brought to justice. Does it happen? Sure, on occasion, but not that often. It's rare that we convict police officers for killing unarmed people of color in this country. So when we move forward and talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, and granted, it's a movement. Black Lives Matter is not an organization. They don't have a hierarchy. There's not elected officials. They don't have a board of governors. They don't have a formal structure. The Black Lives Matter movement is just that. It's a social movement. It's an ideological and political intervention. Ultimately, what they're saying is they acknowledge that Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. You could argue whether they are intentionally targeted. We could argue that point. The Black Lives Matter movement is an affirmation that Black lives do, in fact, matter. And when I talk about Black Lives Matter and people get upset, my question is, are you not sure that Black lives do, in fact, matter? Is that what you're upset about? Or when I say Black Lives Matter and your retort is Blue Lives Matter, that's like walking into a cancer hospital and yelling, you know, there are other diseases too. If I say Black Lives Matter and you say Blue Lives Matter, I got to tell you, having worn a uniform for 15 years, blue is not a life. Blue is an occupation. Blue is a choice. At the end of my day, at the end of my shift, I get to pull off my blue uniform. I'm no longer blue. There is yet to be a situation in 50 years where I can pull off my blackness and be something other than black. Black is a life. Blue is not a life. So if I say Black Lives Matter and you say all lives matter, two things. One, all lives can't matter unless Black lives do in fact matter. And for those of you out there that are married, and you acknowledge there are times if your spouse were to come up to you and ask, honey, do you love me? For those of you that have been married any length of time, you acknowledge if your spouse has to ask you if you love them, a light should be going off over your head that there's a problem. If they have to ask if you love them, there's a problem. So if they ask, honey, do you love me? And you say, I love everybody. How's that going to work in your relationship? So when we say Black Lives Matter, it's because we're pointing to a definitive problem. And you saying in retort, all lives matter, is missing the whole point, because all lives can't matter until Black lives do in fact matter. And remember, Black Lives Matter is not anti-police. It's not anti-police at all. Black Lives Matter as a movement had nothing to do with the police. Remember, it started in social media as a hashtag in 2013. after the acquittal of George Zimmerman when he killed Trayvon Martin. Sanford, Florida, had nothing to do with the police. Some of the principles in the Black Lives Matter movement include diversity, restorative justice, globalism, accountability, because Black Lives Matter is not an American thing. Twice when I was in Australia giving talks on community policing and comparative policing, both times I was in Australia, there were Black Lives Matter movements. When I was in Great Britain, there was a Black Lives Matter protest there. When I was in Stockholm, they had a Black Lives Matter protest in front of the hotel that I was staying in. So Black Lives Matter is not just an American ideal. It's an ideal that points to the devaluing of Black lives, many times at the hands of the police. But it's not just the police, because the Black Lives Matter movement marches in the south side of Chicago a lot. Because the inner city crime that happens when Black people die there, the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to work with the government to try to fix some of the problems there. Because remember, crime is not the problem. Crime is symptomatic of larger problems in society. And Black Lives Matter is not anti-police, they're anti-bad cops. And I acknowledge the vast majority of police officers in this country, God-fearing, law-abiding citizens, but that begs the question, where are all of these good cops when the bad cops are doing bad things? And if the good cops are standing by when bad cops are doing bad things, if good cops are standing around when somebody's kneeling on somebody's neck for 9 minutes while they're handcuffed, aren't they really bad cops too? The Black Lives Matter movement is about accountability. Ultimately, it's about accountability. Black Lives Matter is not an organization. There was a court case where somebody in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, tried to sue members of Black Lives Matter, and the judge there said that Black Lives Matter is a social movement similar to the civil rights movement or the LGBTQ plus movement or the Tea Party movement. It's not an entity capable of being sued because it's not an organization. It's an idea. They're ideals, they're principles. Black Lives Matter is a social movement. And people say, I belong to Black Lives Matter. That's like saying, I belong to democracy. People can't support the Black Lives Matter movement and not be part of Black Lives Matter. And people tell me all the time that I see all these people there and they hold up a Black Lives Matter sign and they do stuff. Just because they hold up a sign doesn't mean they're part of a movement, because I can stand in my garage all day long and that doesn't make me a BMW. Black Lives Matter is a philosophy, it's an ideology, it's a social movement that's pointing to the devaluing of Black lives, many times at the hands of the government vis-a-vis the police. And when we see these struggles, to the far right, young man, dog taking a bite out of him, police beat him up. I had other pictures, but they were a little gruesome. I decided not to show. Then the question is, what did this guy do? He was protesting for the right to vote. Let that resonate for a minute. This guy that's being bit in his torso by a dog, he simply wanted the right to vote. We're talking about equality here. We're not talking about anything extra. And remember the question when people are anti-protesting or anti-change? Think about who is it that's against this change. Because there are some people that are so used to privilege that equality feels like oppression. Many people are protesting just for civil rights or human rights. Let's look at some of the signs that we see in some recent movements. George Floyd isn't a wake-up call. The same alarm has been ringing since 1619. Y'all just kept hitting snooze. And if you want to know what seminal event happened in this country in 1619, feel free to go ahead and Google that. The I can't breathe scenario, that's not new. That's not specific to Eric Garner in Staten Island in 2014. Police officers have been choking out people of color in this country since they've been here. Sometimes with their arm, sometimes with a PR-24 baton, sometimes with a noose. The I can't breathe mentality, that's not new. That's a cry that's been yelled for generations in this country. Judging a demonstration by its most violent participants, but not judging the police by its most violent cops, is language of the oppressor. We live in a world where trained police officers can panic and act on impulse, but untrained civilians must remain calm with a gun in their face. When we talk about why people are doing the things that they're doing, why people are so upset, let's go back to the stages of grief. A couple of years ago, I lost my dad, so I intimately understand the stages of grief. It starts with denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Black people in this country, if I may use them as a monolithic group, many people of color in this country are dealing with vicarious trauma, because every day when they turn on the TV or turn on the news, they see Black pain and Black death, many times at the hands of the government or the hands of the police. They're going through racial battle fatigue. And it starts with the denial process where they say, I can't believe it's happening again. I don't believe they just did this. Because immediately in the weeks following the George Floyd murder, we have on videotape other police officers kneeling on the necks or heads of other people of color that were in handcuffs. The level of denial. Then they go into the stage of anger, where people start protesting. They start rioting. They start trying to shut things down. And that lasts for a period of time. And then they move into the bargaining phase where they decide, okay, we're going to work. We're going to come to the table. We're going to talk about it. We're going to work with elected officials. But as soon as they get to the bargaining phase, yet another unarmed person of color is killed by the police. And a lot of people in the Black community are in a perpetual stage of anger. They don't have the luxury of moving through these stages of grief because it keeps happening over and over and over again. And I would argue that there's a significant number of people in the Black community or people of color who aren't experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder because they don't have the luxury of the post part of it, because we don't get past it, because it's constant and continuing. It keeps happening. People are going through vicarious trauma. Again, how bad are things to protest against the government, protest against the police, and do it during a global pandemic? And when we're upset about the protesting, remember, our country was formed on protesting. Our country was formed on the destruction of property. Now it's not convenient for us now, but that's a level of privilege if we take that position. And when I talk to police officers, they say, I get what you're saying, Dr. Boyd, but that's not me. I'm not in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I'm not in Minneapolis. I'm not in Detroit. I'm not in these places. That's not me. So then I relate to them a story. I was out at the park with my grandson, Joe, when he was 5 years old. We were out in the park and we were throwing the ball around. And then a lady came into the park with a dog. So my grandson saw the dog and said, uh-oh, and he ran over behind me and kind of hid behind my leg. And the lady says, oh, it's okay, you can pet the dog. And my grandson said, no, thank you. So she walked over towards us with the dog and said, oh, he's a nice dog, you can pet him. And my grandson looked at him and said, no, thank you, ma'am. So the lady kneeled down directly in front of me and picked up this cute little furry dog, and she's patting the dog's head and says, you can pet the dog, he doesn't bite. And my grandson leaned in with the little furrowed brow and says, your dog doesn't bite? But doesn't your dog have teeth? That was prolific. A 5-year-old got me to understand why people are having a hard time dealing with the police. Because the police will say to you, I'm not going to hurt you. But then when you look at their Batman utility belt, everything they have on their belt are instruments of pain. handcuffs, baton, pepper spray, taser, firearm, but yet you're not going to hurt me? So here's a rhetorical question for you. When we think about perception of the police, understand that people bring their views and perceptions into everything they do. How often do you need to get bit by a dog before you decide, I don't want to play with dogs anymore? How often do you have to see someone else get bit by a dog before you decide, dogs, nah, I'm not a dog person, I'm a cat person? Because people take their perceptions. If you constantly see the police killing people of color, particularly unarmed people of color, does it make any sense to you that a lot of people of color decide, I don't want to mess with the police at all. I'm going to totally avoid them. I'm not going to talk to them. I'm not going to assist them. I'm not going to deal with them at all. How often do you have to see somebody get bit by the police, bit by a dog, before you decide you don't want to play with dogs? Because perception is reality, at least for them. So the pathway forward, how do we build a better cop? And this is the last point I'm going to make. When I took over the Center for Advanced Policing, they said we're going to build a better cop. And I said, no, we're going to abandon that. We're going to take a holistic approach to developing a better person and then usher them into policing. And we did it with the 4-step process. 1, we instilled levels of compassion. 2, we instilled levels of empathy. 3, we spend a lot of time building communication skills, because a good police officer avoids using force through creative, effective communication. And 4, we build critical thinking skills. Because something is legal, it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. So if you're a police officer and you're running radar and the speed limit is 55 and you catch somebody doing 80 and a 55, are you going to stop them? Yeah, absolutely you are. Are you going to ticket them? Most likely. So what if you stop this person going 80 miles an hour and you walk up to the car and the driver's really nervous and sweating? So now you're on guard because you think something's going on. And you look over beside him into the passenger seat and you see a woman pregnant in full labor, water broke. Are you still going to give this guy a ticket? Because something is legal, it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. Thank you. Thank you for listening. And I will take questions. Larry?
Okay. Let me first mention something that I might have left out of my, let's see if I can, there I am.
There you are.
Introduced you. And that is, after I met him at that conference later that year, we've been friends ever since. I don't know if I made that clear.
We've been best friends for 20 plus years. And actually, I think my mom even made a cake for you, if I remember correctly.
More than once. Anyway, let me, I have a few questions. Ooh, what happened? I have a few questions here. The first one is, what do you, will you help me? Just give me 1 second, I apologize. Okay, first question from Joanne is, what do you think about these unmarked vigilante groups who think they have to defend our safety? Who are they, and is there any law to limit their activities? What do you think will happen after the election, one way or another?
Wow, those are loaded questions. I think the vigilante groups are problematic, but the way they are being characterized, I think, is also problematic, because a lot of times in the media or in the government or the current administration will often refer to them as militia groups. They're not supplementing our military. They're not the militia. These people are domestic terrorists. So let's call them what they are. Anytime you get a armed group of people with assault-style weapons marching and taking over the state house in Michigan and forcing the elected officials to do business elsewhere, that's problematic, and we need to address that and we need the police to do what they're supposed to do. But unfortunately, I've talked to way too many police officers who seem ultra sympathetic to their cause to make me wonder, how connected could they be to that? Because there are situations where we do have on video in Kenosha, Wisconsin, people with long guns, these militia groups, air quotes, with long guns, and the police waving at them as though they're actually part of the group. That's problematic. We need to stop that, and we need to hold them accountable. But also, we need to hold the police accountable for doing their job. And if I may borrow a quote from the final summation of Johnny Cochran from the OJ trial, who polices the police? We've seen that we train police the same way for the last 110 years. The level of training for police needs to actually change. And I'm saying that from an introspective lens, from someone that actually trains the police, we need to change that. And what is going to happen after the election depends on how many people vote. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Now, another question, which I know you are capable of, are more than capable of answering, is also from Joanne, is how can the president prohibit racial awareness training programs? I think you have your foot in that, right?
Yeah, prior to the middle of September, I've got a consulting company that does training, and prior to the middle of September, we had about 22 different municipalities asking us to come in and do cultural competence training. And they acknowledge that there's a disconnect between the police and communities of color. And many police officers are saying, help us understand what the problem is. Help us understand the community. Give us that inconvenient history so we can move forward. And there's a lot of police officers that are saying this is what we actually need. And from the presidency saying we're going to stop any sort of race-based training, any cultural competence training, because it makes people hate America. If America has done hateful things, what do you expect? If America has done things that have been problematic for certain segments of the population for so long, would we not expect people to have ill feelings? And then people ask me, and I forgot the guy's name on Fox News, who said to me, what is the role of communities of color in building relationships with the police? And I thought about it for a minute, and then I turned the question around. I said, would you ask a battered woman what's her role in building a better relationship with her battering husband? Because the power dynamic is such that that's actually not a fair question.
Leonard asks, who is funding Black Lives Matter, and or is it being funded?
Black Lives Matter is not an organization that's being funded. Black Lives Matter is a philosophy. It's an organization. That's like saying, who funds the civil rights movement? There's not a funding source for the institution. Are there individual people who claim to be part of Black Lives Matter that may get money from somewhere? I guess they could say that. So on the same token, if I decide that I'm going to fly to another city and don a Black Lives Matter jersey and stand out there, could we then say the University of New Haven is funding it because they actually pay me a salary and I use my money to do it? But Black Lives Matter is not an organization. So don't believe the rhetoric that you hear that there's all sorts of leftist and socialist people funding it and there are people from other countries. It's a social movement. It's not an organization.
Joanne also asks, what is your understanding of this whole idea of defund the police? What does that mean?
That's a fantastic question, and that's something that that I'm dealing with now, and actually I'm working on a book on a chapter that actually talks about that. The defund the police movement is not a new movement. It's a movement that happens every single year. Every May and June, every single police chief and every single mayor does this dance. Defund the police is actually, let's call it what it is, it's resource reallocation. Defund the police does not mean take all the money out of the police so therefore we have no police department. That's not what it means at all. Let me give you some context for this. According to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, between 80 and 90% of a police budget is personnel. salary and benefits. Between 80 and 90% of a police budget is salary and benefits. Of that 80 to 90%, 20% of that is overtime. So what would happen if we take a portion of the money that we use for overtime and reallocate it into preventative reasons for the reasons that we actually need overtime? And here's a case in point. We noticed over the summer that everything is shut down, people aren't paying taxes. So in a lot of cities and towns, Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCA, city services, Parks and Recs is a better example. Parks and Recs are not being funded. They laid a bunch of people off. So now there's a bunch of kids that have nowhere to go. They have no organized place to go. So now they're out in the streets and they're in the parks and they're doing dumb stuff. And now police departments have to bring people in on overtime to deal with the kids that are out there doing stupid stuff because they have nowhere to go. So what if we take a portion of the overtime money that we are paying these cops to chase after these kids, and what if we take a portion of that overtime money and put it back into Parks and Recs so you can get the people off of furlough so you can have a place to watch the kids again? So I spent time working for or with Mayor Garcetti, Eric Garcetti's office in Los Angeles, and they decided that they were going to move $250 million into preventative social programs. So they had $1 million of it set aside. So they were looking for a place to take the other 150 million. So they decided they're going to move $150 million out of LAPD's budget and put it into preventative things that's going to stop, presumably, crime. And people said $150 million will decimate LAPD. Well, the truth is the LAPD annual budget is $1.8 billion. So $150 million is not a whole lot. Not one officer got a reduction in pay. Not one officer got furloughed. They were still able to hire, but they took some of their overtime money and reallocated it into the reason that they need overtime. So why do they call it defund? Because people are hurting and they want to use terms that are going to hurt other people.
You know, can I say something?
Please.
A lot of people don't realize how much police make in overtime and in duty pay and so on. And my last teaching assistant was, well, I'll put his name, became a state police officer in Massachusetts. And just, I looked up how much because they publish all the salaries of how much people make in Mass, and I was wondering how he was doing. And last year he made $170,000 as a police officer.
Yeah, police overtime is really, really lucrative, and that's where they make the bulk of their money. And I don't begrudge them, because I bought a house based on overtime when I was on the job. But understand that crime is not the problem. Crime is symptomatic of larger problems in society. So if we can fix a lot of the underlying problems, then the crime rates actually will go down.
Now, I hope I pronounced this correctly. Pardeep Mehra asked this provocative question. Police kill only about 1% of African Americans who are killed each year. Why not focus on the 99% killed by African Americans themselves? Now, of course, there's some killed by whites, but let's skip over that. So why is the focus on police and not on violence in general?
Well, first of all, I'm going to say this as politely as I can. Your numbers are absolutely positively just blatantly wrong. So if you want to find out the percentage of people that are being killed, go to FBI.gov. Left side, halfway down, Bureau of Justice Statistics. You can go in there and find the percentage of people of color that are being killed. So it's not that people are not focusing on that, because people are focusing. Remember, the Black Lives Matter movement is also in Detroit. It's also in Chicago. It's trying to fix some of the systemic problems in these communities as well. But police are held to a higher standard. Police are killing unarmed people, and they are an arm of the government. So they're held to a higher standard. So yeah, we need to hold them accountable as well. 1%? No, that's absolutely wrong. It's considerably more than that. But let's talk about a level of ratio. There's a higher percentage of people of color killed by the police than whites are killed by the police. The vast majority of people that are killed by the police in this country happen to be unarmed. Don't believe me? Fact check me. Bureau of Justice Statistics, bjs.gov.
I've been there many times. This is an anonymous question that says, isn't there an organization, and pardon my pronunciation, founded by Alicia Garza, Patrice Collars, and Opal Tometi called Black Lives Matter? Doesn't negate you're saying that it's a social movement, not a particular organization. Are you familiar with that one? I don't know.
Oh yeah, somebody's been on Google. Somebody's been on Wikipedia. But yeah, Black Lives Matter these are three women from three different parts of the country that never met each other initially until they got pulled together by the hashtag Black Lives Matter right after the Trayvon Martin case. And if you want to read more about the formation of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a book called Appearance, Bias, and Crime. And I'm looking on my shelf and I don't see it. But the Appearance, Bias, and Crime, Chapter 4, is called Black Lives Matter, the watchdog for the criminal justice system. You can get it on Amazon really, really cheaply to read about the actual formation of Black Lives Matter. And by the way, Wikipedia, not an academic source. Anybody can go on Wiki and write anything.
Now, Laura Hansen asks, and I'm not sure if this is in your wheelhouse, about the stand your ground laws in Florida. What do you think? What do you think of those? And if you want to overturn them, what can be done to?
The stand your ground laws are things that are coming up in a lot of different states, and this one, unfortunately, is not something that I'm well versed on. I'm aware of them as they happen in the media, but outside of media portrayals, I don't have much information. So my apologies that I cannot give any sort of formalized response to that.
And can I ask you a question? What's your feeling? I'll give you an easy one. What's your feeling about the future? Do you think these efforts will produce greater understanding? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Do you think there's room for a lot of positive change? Or
ask me the question after November 4, I guess would be. But the one thing I can tell you is a lot of police departments are calling me in to have conversations, and the vast majority of police officers are trying to understand what's going on in order to better serve their communities. And I do feel good about that, because a lot of officers are trying to figure out what's actually happening and how can we get past what we're doing. The flip side of that is there's a lot of pain in the community, and people tend to, dig their heels in. What I'm asking is for people to understand levels of empathy. So when I do police training, I bring community members and police officers together. In the first 2 hours of my training, I train them together, because I need for the police to understand the lived experience of the people that they're policing. I need the police to understand, once you effect an arrest and leave, what happens to that community, what happens to that family. The flip side is I need community members to see the police for who they are, to see that police officers are people trying to do a job, that police officers don't just roll into your house. Somebody calls them into your area. So what happens then? And I need citizens to understand that most cops aren't looking for people to gun down. That's not the way things typically work. But I do understand that there's a systemic problem in policing, and it's a problem that starts with training. And I swear, if I have one more police sergeant and an academy tell me, that each traffic stop could be your last, so you need to make sure you go home safe. Because statistically, last year was among the safest year for police since the Nixon administration. When you look at police feloniously fallen in the line of duty, police officers feloniously killed. So go to the Fallen Officer Memorial Fund and look at the scales of police officers that are dying. Losing one police officer is one too many, but we lost 136, 140 officers last year, and we have more than 750,000 officers. So to me, that's not a war on cops. And the thing that we're not talking about, more police officers died by suicide than by homicide. So if a police officer is going to fall, it tends to be at his own hand. And we don't talk about that. we need to protect the people that protect us. And what that means is we need to pay attention to the wellness of these police officers, because for the third year in a row, police suicide have outpaced police homicide, and we need to take care of the officers. And New York City Police, for the last 18 months, they've been averaging one suicide per month. They certainly haven't had one homicide per month. So let's put shine the light on where we need to really look. We need to protect the police, and sometimes just understanding that it's a dangerous job, we need to give them a release valve. We need to give them an out. And only about 10% of police departments across the country have anything that looks like suicide prevention programs.
Well, Lorenzo, I would like to thank you for doing this. I know you're very busy, and I appreciate, and we all appreciate your taking time from your schedule to address us on this really important and timely topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate being here. And the one thing that I ask of people, before we make snap judgments, try to empathize with the other people and ask ourselves, what has to be going on in their lives in order for this course of action to actually make sense? Let's be empathetic. Let's try to help people. Let's wear masks, less social distance, let's wash our hands, and let's just be nice to other people. Let's start there, because if we can all do that, then I think things will be better.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Take care.